Hello, welcome to today's presentation. The topic is going to be, Did Privacy Kill the Smart City? This is an adaptation from a talk that I gave at the Thompson Rivers University Privacy and Security Conference in 2023, and I'm happy to share a little bit more about what was covered with you today. So to get us started, $680.7 billion, that's the figure that I could find for the global market estimation for smart cities, and this was estimated in 2020. Um, we've heard a lot about this, and just for a little bit of context, other, so to speak, smart industries, smartphones evaluated at $520 billion in 2021 globally, smart watches at 18 billion in 2020, and smart homes 78 billion dollars also in 2020. And in all of these areas, smartphones, smartwatches, we've seen significant changes in the last several years that sort of are commensurate with the evaluation of the market for the same period. But for smart cities, that shift is a little bit tougher to perceive. Feels like our cities haven't changed that much when compared to smartphones in the last decade or so. And so, really, what prompted me to work on this was to ask the question, where's this going? Why aren't we seeing any changes? As citizens, perhaps services are still delivered in the same manner. So, what's going on here? And that was the curiosity behind this presentation. Now, quickly, just a little bit of background on myself. My name is Stefano. I'm a technical product manager at Vivacity Technologies. My purview generally revolves around our security infrastructure products. So we have a public key infrastructure or PKI solution, where we provide a certificate authority for our clients, mainly in the private wireless network space. We do an assortment of application security assessments and working with clients to ensure that their web applications or applications in general are secure from the latest cybersecurity threats or vulnerabilities that have been identified. And in addition, just an overall cybersecurity enthusiast. Love learning, love poking with things, still learning tons about the industry, and it's just something that I enjoy doing. Now, before joining Vivacity, I have a background as a researcher in the field of environmental criminology, where I've done a lot of work with cities before, specifically trying to understand criminal phenomena in the city and crime events and sort of what elements of the built environment and the natural environment might be at play, affecting decision making. So measuring people's sense of safety and fear of crime at different locations, building digital tools for investigators to use technology to try and help solve or otherwise fight criminality. And then, yeah, leveraging big data and analytics to identify trends and things of the sort. So the topic of smart cities obviously is super interesting to me on all fronts. That's why I'm happy to share a little bit more about that with you today. So, in order to get started, we first need to take a step back and think about what is a smart city. And this one is a pretty tricky question, not because it's too deep or meaningful or anything along those lines. It's just that definitions out there are super generic and confusing. Like there's a lot of words and they don't really say anything concrete. And that's very representative of the state of smart cities, so to speak, in 2023, I would pose. So, although definitions are quite different between different vendors and different organizations, there are a few common themes that begin to emerge. So you'll see these sort of bolded words. But from my research, basically, when it comes to smart cities, these terms are generally involved to some extent. So using technology, optimizing efficiencies, or sort of gaining some sort of um, cost savings through technology seems to also be at play. Monitoring and controlling, so that could be the environment, that could be your citizens, that also seems to be involved in most cases. Better decisions, so sort of supporting operational insights, that sort of stuff. Quality of life, so facing, looking at citizen facing elements of what is a smart city. Quality of life is definitely one of the elements that pops up there. Similarly, with sustainable development, improving service delivery for citizens, and just generally using technology to make cities better for citizens and businesses. And so, although there's a lot of drastically varying definitions out there, this generally seems to be these themes generally seem to permeate across most of them. So hopefully that gives us all a slightly better idea of what smart cities really are. Um, the question to follow is now, where are all the smart cities? If the market is worth 680 odd billion dollars yearly, why aren't we seeing that many changes as citizens? Where's all this going? And to answer this question, I had to take a sort of a deep dive into the past and a few of the smart cities that have been out there. And I really wanted to do sort of a good, bad, the ugly approach, but really, doing some research on the topic, it really came down to the bad, the worst, and the ugly. Um, and just to paint a picture of why that tends to be the case, I chose these three examples here because they paint it quite clearly in my eyes. So the first one, Songdo, South Korea, build cities for humans, not for technology. Originally, this started out as a boom of government investing in urban development. It was really focused around the technology and all the innovation that would be enabled in the place. But ultimately, they built it, with that in mind, and then ended up with too high of living costs, not the right conditions to attract a population, and Songdo is basically a ghost town today. Another interesting example is Lavasa, India. So in this case, this was an entirely private city built by this one private citizen who's a billionaire, and had this dream of building a city that would resemble Portofino in Italy, but built in India. And the lesson learned from there is that there's so many shortcomings with not having a true city government, and having the city be owned by a private organization, that the city is still sort of in the process of being built today, but it has fewer than 2,000 inhabitants, and so really falls short of that original vision for the city that they set out. So lesson learned there, corporations are not government. This type of private city build approach when it comes to smart cities has been tried in the past, and I haven't found any examples of it working. And then finally, we have the ugly Ordos, China. So Ordos, China was a region where they experienced a mining boom, and then with that, the government wanted to invest in developing urban centers in the area. Now, Ordos is located already somewhat close to another city that's already important in the region. Um, and it was built around this idea that this would be a new economic center that would be international, sort of resemble what some areas in Singapore look like, in fostering innovation, attracting tourism, attracting foreign investment. But that side of the vision never was realized, and so Ordos really became just this gigantic ghost town, and it's still fairly abandoned to this day. There's still a lot of push from the government in terms of transitioning people from rural populations over to urban centers. And so it still sort of plays a role in that way. But when we look at the original vision for Ordos, it really did fall short of that in the process. And too much money, not enough demand, just don't. That approach does not seem to work. Now, a few more examples of smart cities and efforts that have happened in the past, and really looking at why they didn't go very well. And one of those examples is in Rio, Brazil. Now, I'm originally from Brazil as well, and so this is very close to home for me. But really, Rio is one of the most dangerous cities in the world. There's a lot of problems with criminality, with corruption. But around the time where the FIFA World Cup for soccer, one of the biggest competitions in the world, and the Olympics were both going to be hosted in Rio, among other places in Brazil, within a short span of, I believe, 2 years. IBM and lots of other large companies started sending in proposals of how technology could be integrated and what could be done when it comes to sort of the realm of smart cities within the scope of these large international events. And what ended up happening was Rio purchased a lot of sort of um, projects from these different vendors. So this included areas like monitoring street crime in the hopes that they would offer a safer experience for visitors, observing traffic flow, also to ensure that trip times were manageable and that the experience was reasonable for visitors, and for emergency response in case there was a big event, and an emergency response needed to be coordinated between multiple responders and different parties. Then systems like these were in place through this partnership with IBM. However, in reality, what happens, IBM offered a number of products. There were a lot of integration challenges along the way. The solutions didn't end up solving the problems that they were setting out to solve, or at least not in a way that was acceptable to the city stakeholders. What ensued was then technology was only deployed in a few select areas, which were generally the more wealthy areas of the city, because of a lack of existing infrastructure that needed to be in place, such as the infrastructure needed for security cameras or closed circuit TV. Um, and then ultimately, the data that managed to be collected from these different deployments ended up being siloed, which is a phenomenon that we see a lot in the smart city space, which means that the data gets to live in its own little enclosed box, and never gets to have its value be extracted by other stakeholders or other systems or other platforms. And this greatly diminishes the true value of what a smart city has to offer. Um, yeah, basically this was fairly poorly received, not great outcomes, cost a ton of money, and yeah, not a very big success story, despite being one of the largest smart city deployments in South America. Another important project, and this one is much closer to home for those of us who are based in Canada, like ourselves, Toronto, Ontario. So Google Sidewalk Labs, huge project, was a gigantic vision. Initially, it was up to $1.3 billion, and they were going to take this area of waterfront Toronto, which I believe was at the time industrial space, and the city wanted to redevelop that into something that people could get more value out of. And the vision for this was painted beautifully, and a lot of work and consultation went into make sure that the voice of the community was heard. They're looking at affordable and flexible digital infrastructure, making sure that they were building out a foundation, sort of this core of digital services that they could then build on over time. Urban challenges could be tackled. Sustainability was a huge theme around the whole thing. And really, what was interesting about this is from the start, one of the big concerns was around privacy and the data that was going to be collected. And originally in the proposal, they were going to create this new standard for data collection where the data would be anonymized at the source. All of these wonderful promises, positioning Toronto really well, and just generally a really, really interesting case study. However, in reality, as the project sort of evolved, the scope sort of began to creep up and increase in size. So originally, the 12 acres grew to plus over 200 acres. Residents started to push back significantly against the project. It was perceived as a high tech land grab, just a big tech company barging in and stealing, so to speak, one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in the city. Lots of social movements around it. Google ended up backing out of the data anonymization processes that they had sold originally within the project, and so this caused a lot of frustration and anger among residents and other community stakeholders. Protests ensued, and then ultimately, this project was folded. So they gave up on it, closed it out. No longer going to happen as of 2020. Reasons cited today they include sort of economic uncertainties as a consequence of COVID, but at the time there's no sort of shortage of reports of citizens and protests arising. Yeah, people just were not happy with what Google had proposed. Now, another interesting city is Santander, Spain. This may not be as well known as some of the others, but basically, this is a small town in Spain, and this was the city with the most sensors in the world. And this was still in before the 2010s. So it had 12,000 sensors in 2009, which at the time was just super innovative. And there's a lot of government funding involved in terms of supporting the city and these technology deployments. But really, what they were trying to do was to deploy this technology first and then ask questions later in terms of what could be done. There wasn't much of an interest in that sort of before deployments happened. This was something that came more as an afterthought. So this is how Santander started. Super innovative city, big push around just the technology piece itself, IoT, and just being at the forefront of that in Europe, e-government, and all sorts of different innovative initiatives. Um, what ultimately ended up happening is that this approach, just sensors for the sake of sensors, didn't work out very well. The city was not very well perceived up until the 2010s when they initiated this shift, where instead of looking at the technology that they could deploy and the different sensors that could be out in the field, they started looking at what was the value that the city and the community was looking to obtain from these technologies. And once that perception shift occurred, the output of the projects, the actual result and the value that was being added, started to increase a ton. And so this shift in approach is really, I think, quintessential to understand what one of the larger pitfalls of smart cities are. And that's really, when you start pushing technology for the sake of technology, hoping for the best. Although that might sound appealing in terms of leading the charge and being incredibly innovative, when it comes to looking for that long-term impact and that long-lasting sort of legacy piece, what we've seen so far in the industry is that this shift from just pushing technology and then over to understanding what the problems are that the community faces and how, if in any way, technology can be leveraged to improve or to solve those problems or address them in some way. That's where the key is in terms of seeing that long-term success and legacy for smart cities. Great. So now we know what smart cities are. We know that the industry is worth 600 odd billion every year, and there's a ton of money being dumped. Not all of it in great initiatives. Lots of learning processes along the way. Um, but another really important aspect when it comes to smart cities and just having technology be so close to the citizens and to our community is the aspect of privacy. And when we think of that, especially when it comes to Canada, there's really three main sort of pieces of regulation that might apply when you think at a high level, right? And the first one is PIPEDA. So this is the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, and it's a federal piece of regulation that has jurisdiction over Canada and oversight over private organizations. So public organizations aren't necessarily subject to what rules and regulations exist within PIPEDA. Now, there are entire industries dedicated towards creating awareness and sort of interpreting what's within these regulations and applying it to specific cases. So I'm not going to delve into too much detail here, but in terms of highlights, basically consent is one of its core pillars. So making sure that you have consent of the people or the entities that you're collecting data from. These people have the right to access personally identifiable information. So if I call my bank and I want them to show all of the information today that they have on me, if my bank is a private organization located within Canada, then I do have that right to access my personally identifiable information, or PII. I have the right to challenge accuracy, so I can dispute something that might be shown within the data and claim that it's not true, and I have that right as a private citizen. I have consent to each use. So if the bank is already collecting this data, but now they decide that they're going to also apply it to their newest marketing efforts, whereby they're going to recommend me products based on that data that they collect, they need to obtain my consent for any new ways that they choose to use that data for. It's not, once the data is already there, they have full control over it. I still have a say in how it can be used. And then appropriate safeguards need to be in place, right? So the wording is there basically to make sure that there are potential legal resources that one could take should this information be, part of a breach or should a non-authorized party access it. It's on the private organization to ensure that there are appropriate safeguards in place according to PIPEDA. Now, that is one piece of regulation. There are two others, both of which are at the provincial level now. So there's PIPA and FIPA, and they both serve sort of a similar purpose, but within different spheres, and we'll explain that. So, PIPA, PIPA, Personal Information Protection Act, that one has jurisdiction over the province of British Columbia. So it's a provincial piece of regulation, and it also has oversight over private orgs or organizations, much like PIPEDA does at the federal level. Generally speaking, this legislation is very similar to PIPEDA, except it's not only limited to commercial organizations or commercial use of data. This one, it has a larger range where it will have its protections apply. And then, yeah, again, just iterating, this one applies within British Columbia. So for those of us in other provinces, there may be or may not be other provincial pieces of regulation that could apply. And the counterpart to that, also at the provincial level, is FIPA, Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. Now, this one is overseeing public bodies within British Columbia. And in terms of what rights or what it grants you as a citizen when it comes to your data, is it grants you the right to access records that are in custody or control of public bodies. So you could give them a call or you could send them an email request to see some of the data that they own, and provided that that data is personal to you as an individual, this regulation applies and it secures you that right. All that to say, regulatory landscape around smart cities, there are a number of considerations to be taken, but when we look at a high level in terms of big pieces of regulation that would certainly apply, these three are definitely it. Now, when it comes to smart cities, they need to when it comes to smart cities, they need to succeed not only in sort of a philosophical when it comes to the level of discourse and how the messaging is provided to the citizens, but it also needs to succeed in practice when it comes to being manageable and feasible within, city administration. And so, what we've seen so far, working closely with several municipalities and a few First Nations organizations as well, is that we see concerns being broken up into roughly two categories when it comes to city administrators, and those categories are privacy and cybersecurity. So for privacy, there's a ton of uncertainty and sort of what are perceived to be gray areas by these city administrators when it comes to privacy, personally identifiable information, How do you build those controls and keep up with the technology and how it evolves over time? Um, there are a lot of smart city technologies that may have components that are cloud applications, and sometimes you don't have necessarily the control to keep all of that personally identifiable information in Canada, which is a big concern at times. And beyond all of this, there's a political risk of new technology, right? If something is out there and then that something is later discovered to be, a technology that's being exploited by the manufacturer, and that they're hoarding the data and using it for purposes that are not aligned with what the community wants, there's a lot of potential backlash that could happen. And so these are some of the factors that we see creating a little bit of pushback when it comes to the deployment of smart city technologies, particularly in Canada and British Columbia. And then on the cybersecurity side, there's a ton of considerations that go into play here because municipalities are already notorious for sort of, squeezing juice out of rocks, so to speak, in terms of the resources and being um, already stretched and doing more. Every single person in these municipalities is doing more and contributing more than perhaps they would wish to, just because there's so much work to be done, especially when it comes to technology, IT, and things like that. So cybersecurity is a huge concern because when you start adding these smart city deployments, if you think of Internet of Things devices, different sensors, or different terminals that are going to be deployed in areas of the city for parking or for whatever purpose that might be, each of those is a gigantic new potential cybersecurity concern. It's certainly a potential new vector of attack. And the way these deployments are handled, which is typically a department has a need, they procure a vendor that can service that particular need that the department has, and then that solution sort of lives within this silo of that department or that group of people, and rarely ever gets to be seen outside of it. That means that there's sometimes out there where there's technology like this that's deployed, and IT department or the cybersecurity department or those people that are responsible for making sure that security risks are mitigated and addressed aren't fully aware of the extent of the technology that's been deployed out there. And so cybersecurity is another uh, giant concern in area where we see city administrators sort of pushing back from the idea of smart cities. In addition to the city administrator perspective, there's certainly the perspective of the community. So in the same way that Google, when they tried to build sidewalk labs in Toronto, ended up facing a ton of public pushback for that project, lots of other smaller technology deployments also see that type of response out there. And the reason why we've seen this happen is that typically there isn't a clear understanding or communication of the reason behind a certain deployment, right? They just add a new camera in an area of the city where they feel like it should be there, and the community doesn't necessarily understand the motivation behind that or the why for the project. Um, Engaging on citizens' terms. So this is another big piece, right? Occasionally, cities will put together sort of forums or public discussions, and by nature, the way that those are designed is inherently going to bias the attendee groups um, based on the time, the place, the manner it's advertised, and things of that. So it's typically difficult for citizens to feel like they truly have their voices heard when it comes to some of these deployments. Data collection, why, what, how, and where. So a lot is said these days about the data lifecycle, understanding what data is being collected about you, what it's being used for, how it's stored, and sort of where it's handled. Um, Really, what this leads to is a lot of unknowns, a lot of uncertainties, a lot of sort of feeling in the dark, feeling like the government is out to get you. And this is the sort of sentiment that leads to a lot of that pushback. Another big part of pushback from the community comes from government and governance and ownership of smart cities. So in Toronto, for example, having Google own that part of the city and own a lot of the technology and the data that's being collected, and really being responsible in many ways for the governance of that technology, that didn't strike the community particularly well. Um, so that's why we believe a strong governance plan is necessary to ensure long-term success. Bias and sampling of errors in data collection, bias and opacity of artificial intelligence and its uses, right? So all of this is speaking to that lack of trust that the community has, that this data is being collected appropriately and that biases are being addressed, and that AI, if it's being applied, is being applied properly and conscientiously, making sure that biases are being minimized and that there's enough transparency there that people can understand why decisions are being made and how they might be able to protest those decisions if they don't agree. And then finally, complex and multifaceted problems, right? People very rarely will agree on what a problem is and what the solution is to that problem, right? So living in community as human beings, naturally, that's a part of the deal. And so when you try to apply technology into a domain that is inherently fuzzy and complex and human and has a ton of nuance, it's just, you know, posed to create conflict and create opportunities for discussion, and that isn't always very productive when it comes to smart cities. So, based on all of this, is a smart city dead? I spent a little bit of time kind of contemplating this a little bit, right? Through the research, lots of kind of horror stories, things that didn't go very well. Uh, but then generally, there are a few things that are changing here and there and ways that technology is being applied out there in the context of cities that seems to work well, right? Think of things like bus passes, which may have been around forever in North America, but coming from Brazil myself, I remember when the innovation appeared and what a game changer that was for a lot of people. Um, so when you ask me if the smart city is dead, I don't think so. I think it's on life support. And I think it's on life support because of four core aspects of what has happened or what has transpired so far that has led us to this point. I think the first area or the first curse of the space, so to speak, is a dislike towards vendor lock. A lot of these large tech companies, they tend to want to penetrate the market and to establish it as their own, claim their own market share, and it's very self-serving in that way. And so what we see with the municipalities that we work with is there's a significant dislike towards being locked to a particular vendor for something because you don't know if they're just going to increase their prices in the long term or if you're basically at their mercy. And we see a ton of vendor lock out there in the industry, and that's one of the reasons why we haven't seen as much success or value being extracted from smart cities as perhaps we could have. The second point, intrusive and abusive data practices. Again, Sidewalk Labs example in Toronto and by Google, committing to anonymizing data at the point of collection, but then backing out of that commitment. And Google really being a company whose core business is advertising and targeted advertising. These types of data practices, they just generally don't fly. The population already has, it appears, a predisposition to distrust something that's put in place by government. And then when the government helps a big tech company settle in and put in place their own intrusive and abusive data practices, that's just a recipe for pushback and disaster. The third point is closely related to that, and it's the failure to be citizen centric. So we've seen those in a few of the horror stories that I started with, sort of that good, bad, and the ugly view. And when the needs of the community, when the needs of the citizens, when those voices are not heard and they're not at the core and center of anything that's being developed and deployed, that's just a recipe for disaster, for putting way too much money into something that is ultimately not going to create true value to the citizens or to businesses of a city or to the community as a whole. And so we believe that in order for a smart city initiative, whatever it might be, whatever scale or scope, it has to be citizen centric, stakeholder centric at its core. And then finally, is that smart city technologies, when you think especially of IoT, is that it's super painful to manage at scale. Lots of different network types, lots of different vendors. Many vendors operate their own networks, others don't. So the city kind of has to own some networks, but not other bits. How do you make sense of all of that? How do you create a cohesive strategy on how to manage and how to run and how to scale or grow, that structure, infrastructure in the future? And that's another area that we believe has been a large pain for cities. It's just too much work. There aren't enough resources. It isn't enough of a priority to be concerned. And so we think these are the four largest elements that are contributing to holding back sort of the adoption of smart city technologies, especially when we think of Canada and municipalities here. Now, I mentioned life support before, and I think these are four of the pieces, the most important respirators, so to speak, for smart cities in Canada in particular. The first one, Canada Smart Cities Challenge. This is a federal initiative that occurred a few years ago that helped a lot of municipalities fund a lot of very interesting projects and pilots, and really allowed people to experiment with this type of technology in a way that hadn't been seen before. Closer to where we're based, so in the Vancouver area in British Columbia, Project Greenlight. That is a really interesting initiative. It's a program where startups and organizations and companies can collaborate with government and municipalities in order to test and deploy and pilot different technologies within their facilities. And this is something that really helps accelerate that sort of workflow from, or cycle, I should say, going from an idea or a problem to an idea to ideating and prototyping a solution and iterating several times, and ultimately coming out of it with something that is manageable, that is a product that can be sold and that can add value in other areas as well. So huge shout out to them. Communitech is an organization that has a mission of helping Canadian founders connect with the municipalities and government. And they have a lot of different initiatives, and one of them is the Smart Cities Front, and that's the one that we're most familiar with. So yeah, huge shout out to the work that they do. Lots of very interesting sessions are put forth by these guys, and they're a great help to the industry, helping us make sure that we're still moving in the right direction and believing in this dream that technology can be used for good in the context of government and benefiting the community and all that good stuff. And then finally, but definitely not less importantly, the Mars Discovery District in Ontario. And this is, a Discovery District. It's an area of Toronto, I believe, and there's a big focus on innovation and sort of that innovative company community and helping each other out and generating new ideas, testing them. There's a ton of relationships that occur in there, so it helps you identify a few pilots and things like that. So for municipalities or organizations that are interested in potentially exploring what smart city technology might be, these four organizations are generally a great point to start. They have tons of connections with different companies that can help you address different problems. And so this isn't just a exclusively Vivacity thing. There's an ecosystem of smart cities in Canada, and we definitely want to shout out these four key players in that space that have been a ton of help for us, a ton of help for a lot of different cities out there, and for a lot of different companies out there too. Now, on to sort of the final bits of this presentation is what could a tiny Kamloops startup possibly have to do with any of this stuff? And I say tiny with an asterisk. When I created this presentation, I believe we were up to 5 employees, and we're up to 8 today. So we've been growing steadily since, and it's an honor to be a part of that. But basically, how could a company of our size, a startup in the interior of British Columbia, we're not even in Vancouver area or somewhere where you might expect to see something like this happen. How could we possibly make a difference in all this stuff? And I'll just get a quick shameless plug out of the way here because I'm required to do that. And 3 focus areas for us at Vivacity. So IT consulting, helping municipalities, First Nations organizations, and private companies better understand their IT environments, see what gaps might be in place, performing routine assessments and developing things like a disaster recovery plan, a backup plan, data center assessments, helping migrate from different file sharing mechanisms, designing um, entire file management systems from scratch, and really helping you go from where you are now to where you would like to be in the future. That's our bread and butter. Digital and security infrastructure is an area that I have a little bit more involvement with, and that's where we operate our public key infrastructure and certificate authority solutions. We work a lot with companies as well for security assessments, and really trying to help these same organizations make sense of securing their environments and their deployments in this ever-evolving cybersecurity landscape of 2023. And then finally, Intelligent City and Living Lab. This has been a new area for us. It initially occurred as kind of a spin-off of some of our security infrastructure products and looking at the Internet of Things and looking at talking to our current customers, a lot of whom are municipalities and government organizations, and understanding, where could this be applied? Where are some of the pain points today? And this is, where we get to design, deploy, and maintain intelligent city infrastructure, and it's a direction that we're super excited to continue exploring. When it comes to our horizon, so what we would like to see in the future when it comes to playing this role as a trusted technology partner of municipalities is we would love to see the cities that we work with as the backdrop to test, to inspect, and to perfect new ways of life. We really think of cities as the place where tons of people work, play, live, And so it sounds like the perfect place to have those sort of living lab initiatives and to test new ideas, to put them to practice, and to pilot new things, to see how they work, to engage with the community, to gain feedback, to iterate, and to create joint value to all of those involved, not just one company or one government or one community, but really focus on working together to create something that's a win-win for all of those involved. When it comes to getting to this horizon that we project, there's a series of pathways that I want to share with you. The first one is from data darkness to data light. What we have seen significantly so far is that cities collect a ton of useful data on a ton of areas, and this could be just understanding, properties across the city and property assessments and land parcel information. A ton of cities today have LiDAR data on those properties, which can give you an idea of topology and depth. And on the flip side of that, internally at the city, stakeholders really don't understand what's available to them and how to access it. And the way that this problem is solved is generally fairly manual, right? You throw more people at it, and we know that resources are already, a struggle and a constraint in many cases and in many municipalities. And so, understanding how to better utilize those resources and creating a better way to identify and to work with the data that's available in cities would definitely be of value, and externally as well. Land developers and organizations, they're paying thousands and thousands of dollars to have consultants go and get a rough perception of what terrain might look like in a particular land lot that they might be considering. Now, why do that when the city already has LiDAR data that may already give you the preliminary information that you might need at that stage in the process? From a city perspective, looking at that as a potential non-tax revenue stream, game changer. And so this is one of the largest pathways, most significant pathways that we see in order to get to that future where cities are really the backdrop to test and inspect and perfect new ways of life. Pathway number 2, bridging the trust gap between smart cities and their users. Now, understanding why something is being deployed, why it's being tested, what's the scale of what's being installed out there, and really engaging with the community in creative and innovative ways, and meeting the community and the stakeholders where they are instead of expecting them to come to you with concerns. This is another core area that we believe has to go hand in hand with any technology heavy deployment or project, or even initiative, or the idea of piloting new things, is that there has to be that communication piece, and that feedback, that opportunity to have your voice and your concerns be heard in order to bridge this trust gap. Because if there is no trust, there is pushback, there is political risk, and things just don't move forward in a productive manner. Third pathway, breaking stagnation, fostering responsible action. One of the many things that is said a lot about working with governments, especially municipalities and small government, is that there's a perception that there isn't any innovation in the space. And from our perspective, working closely with municipalities, I don't think they could be further from the truth. I think there's certainly an element of being risk averse, and you run so many critical services and critical aspects of what it means to live as a human. Um, that you definitely don't want to be out there risking it all in order to be a little bit more innovative or a little bit more flashy. Um, but from our perspective, we think that continuing to break this idea of stagnation and of erring on the side of caution on all of the areas, right? Like creating opportunities where innovative things can be tested, they can be piloted with a completely limited scope and a very strong attention to what success truly means and measuring the true impacts of different solutions. Um, those are all ways where we can go from being perceived as stagnant and a place where innovation doesn't truly happen, and continuing to foster the growth of this sort of responsible action, right? Taking steps in a direction that we think is beneficial, and doing so in a responsible way so that we can still step back should this not be what we originally expected. So this is another way, pathway, where we see that could help us get to that future vision. Pathway number 4, making a path for forecasting, improve planning and emergency preparedness. So tons of data out there, but it's just kind of living as is. There's no application. Well, I shouldn't say no. There are very few instances of forecasting applications specifically being built on top of city data. And we believe that continuing to foster the growth of these initiatives can really help, especially when We look at the increased frequency of emergency events, right? Things like flooding, things like wildfires, things like snowstorms or blizzards. All of these are key areas where the city ends up having to expend a ton of resources in order to deal with these disasters afterwards. However, if there was a little bit more preparedness, a little bit more forewarning, that creates the opportunity to handle these more effectively and to, in cases, even prevent the loss of life or limb, um, and just act in the closest manner possible to optimally. And we see this idea of smart cities and enhancing the accessibility to data as a key piece of the path to get us to this point. Path number 5, dismantling silos from the ground up to breed collaboration. This is something that we've heard virtually across all of the organizations that we spoke with, municipalities, First Nations organizations as well, is that data and technology is very siloed in these places. So the data that one department might have available, that one department might find super useful, other departments are often completely unaware of its entire existence. And so dismantling those data silos from the ground up and creating more opportunities for departments to collaborate, to work together on something that's important, and to create joint value, right? Escape from this idea of being boxed into a very particular area and start to think a little bit more holistically about a lot of these complex challenges and problems. That's why we see dismantling these silos and data silos in particular from the ground up create an environment that fosters that collaboration, that sharing of value. Not only can maximize things like operational efficiency, save some resources in terms of, we've seen this happen a ton of, I need, camera imaging of this one intersection, but I can't get that feed, and so I'm just going to buy a new camera and bolt it right below it, right? All of that is waste and it adds up over time. So we believe, breaking down and dismantling these silos from the ground up, creating opportunities for true collaboration, true sharing of data and technology is another integral piece of the puzzle of bringing that vision to life. That's it for today. A little bit of a deep dive in all the research that we've done in the smart city space. It's been an honor to take you through this in a little bit more detail. My name is once again Stefano. My email is at the bottom of the screen there. Please do feel free to contact me should you have any questions or if you would like to delve deeper into any of the areas that was covered today. And as a final word, I'll leave with you is that we'll be at MISA, BC 2023, which will be in the city of Kelowna. We'll be speaking. We'll be lucky to be able to share a little bit more of what we're doing with the city of Kelowna in particular, who's a key player and an incredible innovator in the municipality space. So it's our honor and pleasure to be there. And yeah, I hope to see you there. Thank you very much.